April 7th, 1945. The East China Sea churns beneath a sky that will soon fill with death. Steaming north at 20 knots, the largest battleship ever constructed cuts through the waves on what everyone aboard knows is a suicide mission. The Yamato, named after ancient Japan itself, carries approximately 3,332 men toward Okinawa with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. This floating fortress, weighing more than 72,000 tons, fully loaded and bristling with the most powerful naval guns ever mounted on a warship, represents the pinnacle of battleship design. Yet, within hours, it will become a tomb, and its destruction will mark the definitive end of an entire era of naval warfare. This is not a story of heroic last stands or strategic brilliance. This is the story of obsolescence, of how Japan's mightiest weapon, years in the making and unmatched in raw power, was reduced to scrap metal in approximately 2 hours by an enemy that had already moved beyond the age of the battleship. The Yamato's final voyage wasn't just the loss of a ship. It was the death rattle of a doctrine, a philosophy, and a way of warfare that belonged to another time. As the morning sun rises on that fateful day, American submarine periscopes are already tracking the Japanese task force. Hundreds of miles away, on the decks of American aircraft carriers, pilots are receiving their briefings. The most powerful battleship ever built is about to face the most overwhelming display of carrier-based air power the world has ever seen. What happens next will prove, once and for all, that the age of the battleship is over. The story of Yamato begins not in battle, but in secrecy. In 1937, as tensions mounted across the Pacific, Japan's naval architects began designing something unprecedented. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the subsequent London Naval Treaty had limited battleship construction. But by 1936, Japan had withdrawn from these agreements. Freed from restrictions, the Imperial Japanese Navy set out to build not just a battleship, but a symbol of Japanese power that would dominate any potential enemy. The Kure Naval Arsenal, one of Japan's most important shipyards, was chosen for this monumental undertaking. But this was no ordinary construction project. Massive canvas screens were erected around the building slip to hide the ship from aerial observation. Workers were sworn to secrecy. Even the ships that would transport the massive gun turrets were specially designed with low-profile decks to disguise what they carried. Japan was building a weapon so powerful that its very existence was a state secret. Construction began on November 4th, 1937, under the designation Hull No. 1. The Yamato was designed to be the ultimate evolution of battleship thinking, a vessel so powerful that it could engage multiple enemy ships simultaneously and emerge victorious. Japanese naval strategists believed that quality could overcome quantity. If war came with the United States, Japan's smaller industrial base meant they would be outnumbered. The answer, they believed, was to build fewer ships, but make each one vastly superior to anything the enemy could field. The numbers were staggering. Yamato would displace 65,000 tons at standard load, increasing to over 72,000 tons fully loaded for combat. She would be 863 feet long, with a beam of 127 feet. Her armor belt would be over 16 inches thick in places, with deck armor reaching 9 inches. But the crown jewel of this massive vessel was her main armament, 9 18.1-inch guns arranged in 3 triple turrets. These were the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each gun could fire a 3,220-pound armor-piercing shell over 26 miles. A single one of these shells weighed more than a small car. The construction process pushed Japanese industrial capacity to its limits. Special steel alloys had to be developed. The massive gun barrels required new manufacturing techniques. The scale of the project consumed resources that would be sorely missed later in the war. When Yamato was finally launched on August 8, 1940, only a select group of officials were present. The Japanese public wouldn't even know of the ship's existence until after the war ended. Yamato was commissioned on December the 16th, 1941, just 9 days after Pearl Harbor. Japan's ultimate weapon was ready for war, a war that would prove it was fighting with yesterday's technology. To truly understand the scale of Yamato's loss, one must first understand the scale of Yamato itself. This was not merely a large ship, it was engineering hubris given steel form, a floating city of weapons designed for a type of warfare that was already becoming obsolete. The main battery of 9 18.1-inch guns could fire different types of shells, but the standard armor-piercing round was a devastating piece of ordnance. These shells could theoretically penetrate the armor of any battleship afloat at the expected battle ranges. The guns themselves were so powerful that firing a full broadside could actually push the entire ship sideways through the water. Each turret, designated as number 1, number 2, and number 3 from bow to stern, weighed as much as a destroyer. They were powered by hydraulic systems and could be operated even if the ship lost main power. But the main guns were only the beginning. Yamato carried 12 6.1-inch guns in 4 triple turrets as secondary armament. These alone would have been the main guns on many cruisers. For anti-aircraft defense, she mounted 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns and an ever-growing number of 25mm anti-aircraft guns. By her final voyage, she carried more than 150 of these smaller weapons, a desperate attempt to counter the threat from the air that Japanese designers had not fully appreciated when they laid her keel. The armor protection was equally impressive. The main armor belt used a newly developed steel called VH armor, Vickers hardened, which was believed to be superior to anything the Americans or British had developed. This belt was 16.1 inches thick at its maximum, tapering to 8 inches at the ends. The deck armor consisted of multiple layers: a weather deck, an upper armored deck, and a lower armored deck, combining for up to 9 inches of protection against plunging fire. The magazines where ammunition was stored were surrounded by multiple layers of protection. The design philosophy was clear. Yamato was meant to survive anything that could be thrown at her in a traditional naval engagement. Inside this fortress, a crew of over 3,000 men lived and worked, a number that would swell to approximately 3,332 by her final voyage. The ship had bakeries, a hospital, even a small shrine. Officers' quarters were relatively spacious, with admirals' quarters that included traditional Japanese tatami mat rooms. For the crew, conditions were more cramped, but still better than on smaller vessels. The ship had air conditioning in some areas, a luxury on most warships. There were modern fire control systems, radar, though less sophisticated than American systems, and all the amenities needed for the ship to operate independently for extended periods. The propulsion system consisted of 12 boilers driving 4 steam turbines, producing 150,000 shaft horsepower. This could push Yamato to a top speed of 27 knots. Not particularly fast for a battleship, but adequate for her intended role of engaging enemy battle lines at long range. Her range was approximately 7,200 nautical miles at 16 knots, giving her excellent endurance for long Pacific patrols. Yamato represented the absolute peak of battleship development, the final word in a conversation about naval supremacy that had been going on since the Age of Sail. But even as she slid down the ways in 1940, that conversation was already over. The age of the aircraft carrier had begun at Taranto in 1940, was confirmed at Pearl Harbor in 1941, and would be written in stone at Midway in 1942. Yamato's mighty guns, her impenetrable armor, her overwhelming presence, none of it would matter against an enemy that could strike from beyond the horizon. While Japan poured resources into Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, the nature of naval warfare was undergoing a fundamental transformation. Ironically, it was Japan itself that demonstrated the new paradigm when 6 aircraft carriers attacked Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. The The devastating success of that raid proved that carriers could project power across vast distances without ever bringing their own ships into harm's way. Yet Japan's naval leadership, steeped in decades of battleship-focused doctrine, failed to fully appreciate the implications of their own success. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood carrier warfare better than most Japanese commanders. Yet, even he couldn't entirely break free from the old thinking. The Japanese combined fleets still organized itself around its battleships, with carriers serving as supporting elements. Yamato herself became Yamamoto's flagship, a symbol of command authority, but a ship that saw remarkably little combat. Yamato's war record is surprisingly sparse for a ship of such legendary status. She participated in the Battle of Midway in June 1942, but remained with the main body of the fleet, hundreds of miles from the actual carrier battle. She never fired her main guns at an enemy ship during that entire operation. As American forces sank 4 Japanese carriers, Yamato steamed uselessly in waters too distant to influence the battle's outcome. Throughout 1942 and 1943, as Japan's strategic position deteriorated, Yamato remained largely inactive. She was too valuable to risk, too expensive to operate frivolously, and, increasingly, too vulnerable to commit to battle without adequate air cover. The ship that was supposed to dominate the Pacific spent most of her time at anchor in Truk Lagoon or Japanese home waters. According to some accounts from the period, sailors on more active vessels derisively nicknamed her Hotel Yamato, a jibe at her relative comfort and inactivity, though the prevalence of this nickname among the fleet remains a matter of historical debate. Her first real taste of combat came in October 1944 at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. As part of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, Yamato and her sister ship Musashi steamed toward the American landing beaches in the Philippines. But before they could engage the invasion fleet, they were spotted by American submarines and then subjected to relentless air attacks by carrier-based aircraft. On October the 24th, 1944, Musashi bore the brunt of American attention. Wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers attacked the giant battleship. According to various estimates pieced together from American and Japanese records, Musashi absorbed an almost unbelievable amount of punishment, likely around 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits, though exact counts remain debated by historians, before finally capsizing and sinking. Over 1,000 of her crew went down with her. Yamato escaped with relatively minor damage, but the lesson was clear. No amount of armor could withstand sustained aerial attack. The following day, Yamato did finally fire her mighty guns in anger at the Battle off Samar. In a dramatic encounter with a group of American escort carriers and destroyers, Yamato and other Japanese heavy ships had what appeared to be a vulnerable enemy force at their mercy. Yet, in the confused battle, with American destroyers making desperate torpedo runs and laying smoke screens, the engagement proved less decisive than the Japanese had hoped. Yamato scored hits on several American vessels, including helping to sink the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay and likely contributing to the sinking of destroyers. But after approximately 2 hours of action, the Japanese force withdrew. While this gave Yamato her moment of surface combat glory, the battle ultimately demonstrated how even favorable circumstances couldn't guarantee battleship dominance when air power remained the decisive factor. By early 1945, the strategic situation was hopeless. American forces were closing in on Japan itself. Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, was the next target. The Imperial Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self. Most carriers sunk, fuel desperately short, trained pilots nearly extinct. In this context, Japan's military leadership began considering desperate measures. Yamato, the pride of the fleet, would be given one final mission. In early April 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, beginning what would be the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese High Command was determined to resist with every means available, including what remained of the once mighty combined fleet. According to accounts from Japanese military records, when Emperor Hirohito was briefed on defense plans that focused heavily on army and air operations, he reportedly asked about the Navy's role. questioning whether they had no ships left to contribute. This inquiry, whether direct or interpreted through the military hierarchy, appears to have pressured naval commanders to devise some kind of naval response. The plan they devised was less a military operation than a ritual sacrifice. Operation Ten-Go, roughly translated as Operation Heaven No. 1, called for Yamato to lead a small surface force to Okinawa, beach herself on the island's shores, and use her massive guns as stationary artillery while the crew fought as infantry. The plan was operationally insane. To reach Okinawa, Yamato would have to steam through waters dominated by American air power. Even if she somehow survived the journey, beaching such a massive ship would accomplish little against an enemy that controlled the air and sea. But Operation Ten-Go wasn't about military logic. It was about honor and desperation. With Japan facing defeat, military leaders felt compelled to send the nation's mightiest weapon into one final battle, no matter how futile. Official orders allocated only enough fuel to reach Okinawa, approximately 2,500 tons, less than half of what would be needed for a return trip. According to some accounts, personnel at Tokuyama may have secretly provided additional fuel beyond the official allocation, though this probably still fell short of what would be needed to return from Okinawa. Even scraping together adequate fuel was difficult given Japan's desperate shortage of oil by this stage of the war. The task force assembled at Tokuyama on April 6, 1945. In addition to Yamato, it consisted of the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. There were no aircraft carriers, no air cover, no realistic hope of success. Admiral Seiichi Ito, who would command the force from Yamato's bridge, reportedly argued strenuously against the operation. According to some accounts, when ordered to proceed anyway, he accepted his fate with resignation. One often cited anecdote suggests he remarked that this is the bloom of a flower, though the exact words and circumstances remain debated by historians. On the evening of April 6th, the sailors of Yamato were given a final meal, a special ration of white rice instead of the usual barley mixture, sweet red bean rice, and sake. Many wrote letters home that would never be delivered. Some visited the ship's small Shinto shrine. Based on survivor accounts and the circumstances of the mission, the mood appears to have been somber, but resolved. At 3:30 p.m., the task force weighed anchor and steamed out into the Bungo Strait. The departure did not go unnoticed. American submarines USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback were patrolling the area and spotted the Japanese ships emerging from the inland sea. They shadowed the task force throughout the night, radioing position reports to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. By dawn on April 7th, the commanders of Task Force 58, the U.S. Navy's fast carrier task force, were planning their response. Aboard Yamato, the crew went to battle stations as daylight approached. The ship's anti-aircraft batteries were manned, damage control teams stood ready, and the fire control officers prepared to defend against the attack everyone knew was coming. In the junior officers' quarters, some played cards or wrote final journal entries. On the bridge, Admiral Ito looked out at the increasingly rough seas and knew that by day's end, most of the men under his command would be dead. There was a tragic inevitability to what was about to unfold. Japan was sending its most powerful weapon into battle against an enemy that had perfected the very tactics that could destroy it. Yamato's massive guns, her thick armor, her symbolic importance. None of it would matter against what was coming. The Americans weren't sending battleships to duel Yamato gun-to-gun in the traditional way. They were sending hundreds of aircraft from multiple carriers, and they had learned, through years of war, exactly how to sink a battleship from the air. While Yamato steamed toward her doom, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 was preparing the response. This was arguably the most powerful naval force ever assembled. 11 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers operating together, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. But it was the carriers that mattered. On their decks sat over 1,000 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. manned by experienced pilots who had been honing their skills against the Japanese Navy for years. When word came that Yamato and her escorts were at sea, there was no debate about the response. Admiral Mitcher's operations officer reportedly said, "Inform Admiral Spruance that if the Japs are willing to come out and play, we are willing to sink them." The only question was how many carriers to send. Mitcher decided to use everything available. Multiple carrier groups would launch coordinated strikes, ensuring overwhelming force. American naval aviation had evolved tremendously since Pearl Harbor. Early war attacks had often been poorly coordinated, with different squadrons arriving at different times and attacking piecemeal. By 1945, American carrier groups had perfected the art of the coordinated strike. Fighters would sweep in first to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then, torpedo bombers would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the target ship to evade in one direction while exposing itself to torpedoes from another angle. Finally, dive bombers would attack from above, targeting the deck and superstructure with armor-piercing bombs. The plan for attacking Yamato drew on lessons learned from sinking Musashi at Leyte Gulf. That battle had shown that even super battleships could be overwhelmed by sustained aerial assault. The key was to achieve multiple torpedo hits quickly, enough to cause flooding that would slow the ship and make it an easier target for follow-up waves. The Americans knew Yamato's armor was formidable, but they also knew that torpedoes struck below the waterline where armor was thinner, and that bombs could penetrate deck armor if dropped from sufficient altitude. Beginning at 10 a.m. on April the 7th, American carriers began launching aircraft. The first strike wave consisted of 280 aircraft, 58 dive bombers, 54 torpedo bombers, and 168 fighters. They formed up and headed south toward the last reported position of the Japanese task force. A second wave of 106 aircraft followed. In total, nearly 400 American aircraft would participate in the attack. For the American pilots, this was a unique opportunity. Most had never seen a battleship as large as Yamato. She was substantially bigger than anything in the US Navy. Some pilots later recalled being stunned by the sheer size of the ship when they first spotted her. But shock gave way to professional focus. They had a job to do, and they were very good at their jobs. Flying conditions were poor, scattered clouds and squalls, rough seas below. But these were veteran pilots flying from stable carrier decks with modern aircraft. Many were flying the F-6F Hellcat fighter, the SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber, or the TBM Avenger torpedo bomber, all superior to the Japanese aircraft that might have opposed them, had Japan had any carriers left in the area. The technological and training advantage was entirely on the American side. As the strike groups approached their target around 12:30 p.m., pilots could see Yamato in the center of a defensive formation, with her escorts arrayed around her. The sea was rough, with Yamato throwing up enormous bow waves as she maneuvered. Anti-aircraft fire began reaching up toward the American formations. The battle was about to begin, a battle that would be utterly one-sided and brutally quick. At 12:32 p.m., the first wave of American aircraft began their attack runs. Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with bursts and traces. The 25mm guns chattered, the 5-inch guns boomed, and even some of the main 18.1-inch turrets fired special anti-aircraft shells filled with incendiary material that burst in the air, creating walls of fire meant to destroy incoming aircraft. But there were too many attackers coming from too many directions. The American attack was a masterpiece of coordination. Fighters strafed the deck, suppressing anti-aircraft batteries and killing gun crews. Torpedo bombers split into multiple groups, approaching from different bearings. Yamato's captain tried to maneuver, turning the ship to present the smallest target to one group while necessarily exposing her flanks to others. It was an impossible situation. The first torpedoes struck at 12:41 p.m., 2 hits on the port side. Yamato shuddered from the explosions. Below decks, damage control teams rushed to contain the flooding, but these were massive weapons. Not the small torpedoes of earlier wars. Each explosion tore enormous holes in the hull, and seawater began pouring in. More torpedo hits followed in rapid succession. 4 more on the port side by 1 p.m. The ship began listing to port as flooding accumulated on that side. Counter-flooding measures, deliberately flooding compartments on the opposite side to balance the ship, were only partially effective. The list increased to 5 degrees, then 10, then 15. More ominously, the ship's speed began to drop. A fast-moving ship was harder to hit, a slowing ship was doomed. Dive bombers screamed down from above. Bombs crashed through the deck, exploding in the ship's interior. One massive bomb penetrated near the base of the mainmast, starting fires that would prove impossible to contain. Another hit near turret number 1, jamming the massive guns in place. The superstructure was torn apart by near misses and direct hits. Communication systems failed. Fire control systems went offline. Yamato was being dismembered piece by piece. On the bridge, Admiral Ito and Captain Kosaku Ariga struggled to maintain control of the battle. But there was no battle to control, only death falling from the sky in waves. The second American attack wave arrived at 1:30 p.m., adding more aircraft to the overwhelming assault. By this point, Yamato's list had increased to over 20 degrees. Massive internal flooding had spread throughout the port side. The ship's speed had dropped to less than 10 knots. More torpedoes struck home. Historical records vary, but most accounts suggest Yamato absorbed at least 10 to 13 torpedo hits, the vast majority on the port side, and at least 6 to 7 bomb hits. The exact count will never be known with certainty because the damage was cumulative and catastrophic, with each new hit exacerbating existing flooding, spreading fires, or destroying systems needed to fight the damage. By 2 p.m., Yamato's list had increased to 35 degrees. This was beyond the point of recovery. The massive battleship was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. On the bridge, Admiral Ito gave the order to abandon ship. According to survivor accounts, Captain Ariga chose to go down with his vessel. Historical records suggest he lashed himself to the compass pedestal, though the exact circumstances of his final moments, like those of many who perished, can only be pieced together from fragmentary testimony. Below decks, the scene was apocalyptic. Compartments were flooding, and men were trapped by jammed hatches or impassable corridors filled with debris and fire. The list made it nearly impossible to move around the ship. As the angle increased, men began sliding across decks, slamming into bulkheads. Equipment broke loose and became deadly projectiles. In the engine rooms, crew members stayed at their posts even as the list made their positions untenable, trying to maintain power for as long as possible. At 2:05 p.m., American pilots watched as Yamato's list suddenly increased dramatically. The ship rolled onto her port side, her massive hull rising out of the water to reveal the barnacle-covered bottom. For a moment, she hung there, the greatest battleship ever built, capsized and dying. Then her magazines detonated. The explosion was visible for miles, a massive column of fire and smoke that rose thousands of feet into the air. The blast was so powerful that American pilots flying over the ship felt their aircraft buffeted by the shockwave. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. The ship that had taken years to build, that represented the ultimate evolution of battleship design, had been reduced to fragments of steel raining down into the East China Sea. From the first attack around 12:30 p.m. to the final explosion at 2:23 p.m., the engagement lasted less than 2 hours. Barely enough time to destroy the most powerful battleship ever constructed. The human cost was staggering. Sources vary slightly, but historical records suggest that of Yamato's crew of approximately 3,332 men, only 269 to 277 survived, meaning roughly 3,055 sailors perished with their ship. Admiral Ito went down with the ship, as did Captain Ariga and most of the crew. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sunk in the engagement. The remaining destroyers rescued what survivors they could and retreated to Japan. On the American side, losses were astonishingly light. 10 aircraft shot down and 12 damaged, with fewer than a dozen American servicemen killed. The disparity tells the story. In 2 hours, American carrier aviation had accomplished what would have been impossible for traditional battleship warfare. No amount of armor, no size of guns, no thickness of steel could protect against an enemy that could attack from the sky with impunity. In the days following the sinking, the few survivors of Yamato struggled to comprehend what had happened. They had served on a ship that seemed indestructible, that embodied Japanese naval power and pride. To see it destroyed so quickly, so completely, was traumatic beyond description. Many survivors suffered from hypothermia after hours in the cold water. Others bore terrible wounds from the battle. All carried psychological scars that would last their entire lives. For the American forces at Okinawa, Yamato's destruction was welcomed news, but hardly celebrated. The battle for Okinawa was grinding on with horrific casualties on both sides. Japanese kamikaze attacks were taking a terrible toll on American ships. The Yamato sortie, had it succeeded in reaching Okinawa, could have complicated the invasion. But most American commanders had been confident from the start that the Japanese task force would never make it through. The sinking confirmed what was already known. American naval aviation dominated the Pacific, and no Japanese surface force could operate without air cover. The strategic impact of Yamato's loss was minimal simply because Japan had already lost the war. By April 1945, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Imperial Japanese Navy effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force after Operation Ten-Go. What ships remained in Japanese ports would never sortie again. They would be sunk at anchor by American aircraft, or destroyed in port by American bombing, or they would survive to be surrendered in August. But the symbolic impact was enormous. Yamato had represented more than just firepower. She was a symbol of Japanese naval tradition, of national pride, of the belief that Japanese engineering and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. Her destruction demonstrated the futility of that belief. The age of the battleship, which had defined naval warfare for centuries, was definitively over. The future belonged to carriers and aircraft, to guided missiles and submarines, to weapons that could strike from beyond visual range. For naval historians and military strategists, Yamato's sinking became a case study in technological change and strategic rigidity. Japan's investment in super battleships had been a massive misallocation of resources. The steel, labor, and money that went into Yamato and Musashi could have built multiple aircraft carriers or hundreds of aircraft. By the time Yamato sailed on her final mission, she was obsolete. Not because of any flaw in her design, but because the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. The human toll across the entire task force was devastating. Estimates suggest that between 3,700 and 4,250 men who sailed on Yamato and her escorts perished in the engagement. The light cruiser Yahagi and 4 of the 8 destroyers were also sunk. The remaining destroyers rescued what survivors they could and retreated to Japan. On the American side, losses were astonishingly light. 10 aircraft shot down and 12 damaged, with 12 American airmen killed. The disparity tells the story. In 2 hours, American carrier aviation accomplished what would have been impossible for traditional battleship warfare. The wreck of Yamato lies approximately 180 miles southwest of Kyushu, at a depth of about 1,120 feet. It was discovered in 1985 by a Japanese expedition and has been visited several times since by underwater vehicles. The images are haunting. Massive gun turrets lying on the seabed, the shattered hull partially buried in silt, debris scattered over a wide area. The wreck is considered a war grave, and out of respect for the thousands who died there, its exact location has never been publicly disclosed. In Japan, Yamato holds a complex place in national memory. For some, she represents the sacrifice and determination of the men who served on her. For others, she's a reminder of the militarism and strategic folly that led Japan to disaster. The ship has been featured in numerous books, films, and anime, including the famous Space Battleship Yamato series that reimagined the vessel as a starship. The Yamato Museum in Kure, near where she was built, houses a 1 to 10 scale model and attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. For naval architects and military historians, Yamato represents a fascinating evolutionary dead end. She was, in purely technical terms, a magnificent achievement, the culmination of battleship design taken to its logical extreme. Her construction pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the 1940s. But she was also a ship without a mission, obsolete from the moment she was commissioned, a solution to a problem that no longer existed. The lessons of Yamato's sinking influenced post-war naval development worldwide. The age of the battleship was over. The last battleship built by any nation was commissioned in the early 1950s. Carrier aviation became the dominant form of naval power projection, a position it holds to this day. The idea that surface ships could dominate purely through firepower and armor gave way to integrated systems combining aircraft, missiles, submarines, and electronic warfare. Yet, there's something deeply human about Yamato's story that transcends tactical lessons and strategic analyses. She represents the eternal tension between innovation and tradition, between recognizing change and clinging to familiar ways. The Japanese naval leadership of World War II had been raised in the age of battleships, had studied the great naval theorists who preached decisive battle between battle lines. They had invested their careers in mastering battleship warfare. Even when presented with evidence that aircraft carriers had changed everything, they couldn't fully let go of the old paradigm. This is a pattern that repeats throughout military history. Cavalry commanders who couldn't adapt to machine guns, fortress builders who couldn't accept that aircraft had rendered fixed defenses vulnerable, strategic bomber advocates who believed air power alone could win wars. Yamato's story is their story writ large on the ocean, a powerful reminder that military institutions must constantly evolve or face irrelevance and defeat. On the seafloor of the East China Sea, corroded and broken, lie the remains of humanity's largest and most powerful battleship. Yamato's story began with ambition and secrecy, with engineers and workers striving to build something unprecedented. It ended with fire and water, with brave men dying for a cause that was already lost, in a battle that proved their ship, no matter how powerful, belonged to an age that had already passed. The Yamato's final voyage lasted less than a day. Her final battle lasted less than 2 hours. In that brief time, American naval aviation demonstrated conclusively what many had already suspected. The battleship era was finished. The massive guns that could hurl shells the size of automobiles for miles. The armor thick enough to stop those same shells. The enormous investment of steel and labor and national treasure. None of it mattered against aircraft that could attack from beyond the range of those mighty guns. There's a poignancy to Yamato's story that goes beyond military history. She was beautiful in her way, sleek and powerful, embodying the best that mid-20th century engineering could achieve. The men who served on her took pride in their ship. They had every reason to believe they were serving on the mightiest warship afloat. When that pride was shattered in the space of 2 hours, when that mighty ship capsized and exploded, taking most of her crew with her, it symbolized more than just the loss of one vessel. It symbolized the end of a way of thinking about war, about power, about how nations could project force across the oceans. Today, when we think of Yamato, we should remember several things. We should remember the men who died, not just on Yamato, but on both sides of the conflict. Young sailors caught up in a war they didn't start. We should remember the folly of leaders who sent thousands to certain death on a hopeless mission more for symbolism than strategy. We should remember the lessons about technological change and the dangers of institutional rigidity. But, perhaps most importantly, we should remember that Yamato's story is not unique. Every age has its Yamatos, powerful systems rendered obsolete by changing technology and tactics, institutions that cannot adapt quickly enough, investments that prove misguided in retrospect. The battleship gave way to the aircraft carrier, which may itself someday be supplanted by unmanned systems or weapons we haven't yet imagined. Yamato's legacy is not found in her mighty guns or thick armor. It's found in the lesson that military power, no matter how impressive, must adapt to changing circumstances or face destruction. On April 7, 1945, in the waters between Japan and Okinawa, that lesson was written in fire and steel and the lives of thousands of sailors. The world's biggest battleship met the future of naval warfare, and the future won decisively in less than 2 hours. The age of the battleship ended not with the signing of treaties or the scrapping of old ships, but with Yamato's death throes in the East China Sea, a massive explosion that sent fragments of the mightiest warship ever built raining down into the ocean, where they lie still, silent witnesses to the price of fighting the last war instead of the next one.